Welcome to what is the last session for Open Access Australasia's Open Access Week. I hope you've been able to make some of the other sessions during the week. I know it's been a really popular week. I'm waiting to hear if we're going to set some records this year. My name is Dimity Flanagan. I am the Manager of Scholarly Communications at the University of Melbourne. I am also on Open Access Australasia's Executive Committee, and this is one of my favourite times of year when I get to facilitate one of these sessions. I always take away a lot of renewed energy around what it is we all often show up to work to achieve, a bit of change and definitely a stronger awareness around open access. So today's session is Vive la révolution, taking back our knowledge. And we have had an amazing team working behind the scenes to put together this session for today. So very big thanks to Richard, Donna, and Elizabeth. So we've got a great session lined up, and it's a bit of a mix this year. We're starting off with a panel, and then we're going to get some presentations around very tangible action programs that people have taken, and then a little bit of collaborative work to brainstorm what we might take away to our own institutions. So before I start, I would like to do the acknowledgement of country. So Open Access Australasia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I myself am joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We also pay our respects to all Indigenous peoples, wherever they are in the world, including the Ngā Iwi Maori, the Tangata Whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I believe now I'm going to hand over to Donna, who is going to do the opening karakia.
Kia ora, Dimity, thank you. Before I start the karakia, just a message to those presenting. No mai, haere mai, piki mai, kaki mai. I mihi ana ki a koutou māturangi pukenga hoki ki tēnei wānanga ipurangi. Ko Donna taku ingoa, no wat reira, kei te mihi, ko taku mahi hei, tuku karakia ki a tātou katoa. So that's just a sincere welcome to you all. And we acknowledge your knowledge and wisdom and skills that you bring to this online session. My name is Donna. I greet you all, and I'm going to open with a karakia or a blessing for us all. The English translation is on the slide, but he karakia tātou. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho, kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, taikie. Kia ora.
Thank you, Donna. So a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. This session is recorded and will be shared under a CC BY license. And just a request that everyone please mute your microphones. And if you have any questions at all, really encourage you to put them in the chat, because we are allowing plenty of question time for our panelists. So with that, I'm sort of going to formally kick off the session. So I really love this theme for this year, and the focus on taking our knowledge back. Obviously, it is just so important in today's rapidly changing research landscape to understand our rights as creators, the rights of our researchers and educators as creators, and that as they're more important than ever. When authors are surrendering their rights to commercial publishers or big tech companies in today's AI landscape, they're handing control not only of how the work is shared and reused, but also who can access it, who can profit from it, and how it can shape the future of knowledge. AI is obviously bringing a lot of questions around licensing, around agreements being signed with publishers, And it's so we're really at a point where people need to understand how to retain those rights and how to exercise them for maximum impact. For Indigenous scholars and communities, rights retention is crucial to uphold data sovereignty, which is key, protecting cultural knowledge and ensuring data governance, and make sure that data governance rests with those whose stories and identities are at stake. By retaining rights, we protect our agency, safeguard our communities, and guarantee our research serves the public good. So with that, I would like to begin the panel session. So we have our speakers today. I'm going to do short introductions. Our speakers are welcome to give a little bit more context as to their background. But we have Professor Kathy Bowrey from the University of New South Wales. We have Kathleen Shearer, who is the Executive Director for the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, COAR. And we have Napera Riley, who is the CEO of Figure NZ. I believe I am first handing over to Kathy to speak.
Hey everybody. Look, I'm an intellectual property lawyer, but I'm going to talk on this concept of who owns knowledge, probably on a different path to what you might expect from an IP lawyer. My background is also as a media and technology historian, and I'm also involved in Australia on a voluntary, really, formation of a national open science task force to try and get past some of the institutional and government blockages we have improving open science. I'm also a member of the Australian Attorney General's Copyright and AI Reference Group, and we're looking forward to hearing a consultation report and their copyright recommendations being released, I believe, next Tuesday. But in terms of taking our knowledge back, I think that we really need to talk about knowledge beyond the terms of rights. We need our knowledge to be meaningful beyond concepts of individual assertions of ownership. Knowledge is about relationships. It's not about property. And so the reason that people, communities, states all regulate access to knowledge is because we generally want processes that authenticate that knowledge, that take responsibility for the content and relate the party or parties who produce the knowledge or disseminate it to the audiences who might be relying on that information, might to reuse it, want to act upon it, and also could be potentially harmed by exposure to it. And obviously this matches in an increasing context of AI and unreliable and irresponsible forms of AI. I'd like to remind people that copyright actually arose to ensure publishers were responsible for the mass dissemination of the written word. The idea of it being an author's right actually in Western terms arose later in the day. But also when we think about the concept of what is an author, the author was really needed to bound an intangible right attached to a protected expression. The author and the text, which could be any kind of content, are really twin concepts. They go together. The author concept was really an enabling device that facilitated commodification. But how author and text connects has always been impacted by the technologies and the structures that regulate access to it. But it's not copyright and it's not authorship that creates the authority of the text. Who the author is, who the peer reviewers are, who the publisher was, the library, the end user, all those interactions are mediation points, and in different ways, collectively, they all speak to the merit of the text. So I think that in the age that we're in, with the datification of everything, we have a significant challenge that we're really not fully appreciating. We no longer really have texts as such. We have data points that are emerging from a different type of condition of production. And in terms of the open access and open science communities, there is a question about our codependency on the technical mediation of knowledge, where knowledge itself is disintegrating. Even in the progressive approaches, I worry that the concept of authorship is morphing and disappearing, and from establishing any relationship, reliable relationship between a researcher and a text, and just becoming a data identifier relied upon to manage and authenticate data flows. And that's a different set of relationships and a different set of issues. So, Open access can be practiced in ways that actually have the same symbolic investment in the verification of ideas and credit as really technoscience capitalism, platform capitalism, even though open technological tools and platforms and open metrics might be used. And in both progressive and authoritarian forms, the author function can really be replicated by a cyborg, by an AI author. And I think that's why it's so easy to co-opt the language of openness for authoritarian agendas like Trump's golden science, for example. So what I'm primarily concerned about and talking to people about is the implications of datification for how we actually now understand what knowledge is and the processes we conventionally use to attribute value to knowledge creation. Human mediation and connection to knowledge is so easily effaced and subject to ongoing processing, and the historical connections between author text communities is atomised, vaporised, universalised, modularised, represented as mere metadata. And so as a humanities scholar and historian and as also an interdisciplinary reader, I think this way of thinking about governance, a teleology of knowledge, is actually quite specific to the times that we're in. And we need to step back and think about and consider as an OA community, whether we are also uncritically reproducing some of those machine logics of platform capitalism through the way in which we practice and organise our communities and our technologies, even though we might believe or hope that we're offering some resistance to some of these movements. That's perhaps a little bit dystopian, but I think there's some quite practical tools, which I'm now going to sort of segue to, because there are things that can slow these processes down and wrestle back control. So for those of us in Australasia, we have moral rights. There's a right of attribution. There's a right against false attribution. So all the things that get called AI hallucinations are breaches of moral rights. We have a right of integrity. All these things matter, but they're not being enforced. They're not being talked about as relevant. Instead, we talk about things like text and data mining rights, which A, don't actually prevent copyright infringement in the way that the tech industry imagines, and B, ignore the whole question of moral rights altogether. Rights retention in Australia, it's still very spotty. It's not quite here, but we should be putting more pressure on our senior leadership about this, because we need to actually really control our own databases, develop our own technologies and our own institutions so they reflect the technological and human values that we actually prize and need. And without that, we are increasingly vulnerable and lose any capacity to control our own copy. Repositories are an important part of that, so that we can make, basically technologies in schools at the scale that we're comfortable with and for the uses that we're comfortable with. And there's another thing that is often always seems to be completely overlooked in university context at the moment, which is our teaching quality and research codes ensure integrity, including in protections of First Nations knowledge. These are not these are not optional, these are mandatory codes. And all our universities say that they take institutional responsibility for that. But when it comes to the age that we're in and the way in which technologies are being unfolded, we seem to be actually suspending that as if it doesn't apply, or we're waiting for the technology to be embedded, and then we'll come back and see what these obligations, which were developed for good reason, may actually mean. So I do think this is a conversation we really need to push with our own institutions. That's my opener.
And quite an opener. And I think dystopian is where we're at when one paper mill has in China commissioned 40,000 AI papers in 1 year. I think we are there. Thanks, Kathy. I've got lots of questions already lined up. I hope people are putting them in the chat. Now I'm going to pass over to Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here in Australia. Actually, I'm usually based in Canada, but I've been in Australia for a week now, so I'm on the same time zone. So for those of you who don't know, I'm the executive director of COAR, which is the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, and we're an international association. We were launched in 2009 to create essentially a global network of open access repositories to provide access to scholarly research outputs. And in that context, of course, rights retention and authors' rights is a very important tool for us to be able to, you know, populate repositories and make those usually articles openly available for the rest of the world, because those articles, as you know, are behind paywalls that are controlled by commercial companies. So what I thought I would do in my opening remarks, and I do have some comments about AI, but I think I'll leave those until till later on, is maybe take you through some of the efforts that are happening in other parts of the world that are more, shall we say, progressed in terms of rights retention. But you know, fundamentally, our principle is that, you know, knowledge is a public good. Research papers, you know, present new knowledge, and they really should be available to everyone to be able to use, apply, and build upon. And so in order to do that, you know, repositories are key. So there's a lot of diversity, shall we say, across the world right now in terms of approaches to authors retaining their rights. Or some countries that have, you know, no approach to this at all. But I guess I would point to Europe as being the most active in this regard. And in Europe, it's happening actually at two levels, but there are actually three levels which, you know, authors can retain their rights. One of the first level, which is probably the strongest level, is actually legislation that enshrines secondary publishing rights into the law in various countries. And they're looking at that. Several countries in Europe are moving towards applying this in their laws. Of course, this is very, very strong if you have a law that that allows you to have secondary publishing rights. And excuse my language because I'm not a legal expert, because it essentially supersedes the publisher contract. So authors feel very, very comfortable in sharing their articles if there is a law in place. And actually, I just learned that Spain has recently adopted a law, a legal obligation, where researchers actually are required by law to deposit their articles into a repository. But of course, the challenge around this particular approach is you have to pass a law. And in many countries, it's very hard to get consensus across, you know, the lawmakers and different parties to be able to move that kind of legislation forward. So it can be done, but it may not be the, you know, the best or easiest approach. The second approach is that you find quite often are either funder or university rights retention policies. And these policies basically say to their authors, because you are funded by me or because you are employed at my university, you are required to retain the rights of your article, even no matter where you publish it. And with this approach, then the authors typically attach a kind of, shall we say, statement to their article when they are submitting it to publication. And the idea is that if the publishers accept this statement, then one can assume that the article can be shared through a repository after it's been published. Of course, there is a chance there that the publisher says, no, we don't want to publish your article because we don't accept your statement. But then, you know, the author has to go and look for a publisher that's friendly to this approach. And then I guess the third level is just like the individual author. So in the case where you don't have an institutional funder policy or a national legislation, then the individual author, of course, can always attach an addendum to their article and and submit that with their article to try to retain their rights. I think we know that the publishers are very sneaky, and they try a lot of different mechanisms to divert authors from attaching these kind of statements, to convince them to pay the article processing charge instead of, depositing an article accepted manuscript. And so there's a lot of sort of strategies that publishers are employing to try to, shall we say, avoid accepting articles that have author rights retention statements. But this is a situation currently, I think, and there are a number of other countries that are also looking at this. For example, Canada the funders are currently considering requiring an author's rights retention statement for all of their funded articles that through the three major funding agencies in Canada. So I think I'll leave it there. And of course, I'd be happy to continue the conversation further down in terms of the implications of open access content freely available and how that could be used or misused by other actors out in the ecosystem, and what we might do to maybe try to shape the future of how AI will be using our content.
Thanks, Kathleen. That was a very helpful breakdown, and I think everyone in the audience is thinking about, oh, what would it be like to have a secondary publishing right in Australia or New Zealand? With that, I'll hand over to our last speaker, Ngāpera.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Ngāpera Riley. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Figure New Zealand Trust. We are a charity. We are primarily, our whole core is to get people of New Zealand using data to thrive. So we are on the open data end of the spectrum. We do a lot of work to get that open. I'm just going to, it's Figure NZ Trust is also, it's the name of our website, which I've just typed into the chat there. We've been around for 13 years doing this work. Originally, the reason why we exist is because we could see that data was becoming more and more commercialized and was going to cause more inequities in our society between those who could access data or quality information and those who couldn't. So essentially, we build a technology that democratizes New Zealand public data. We take data from 175 government agencies. This is all aggregate data. And we open it. We make it accessible for people to find and use rather than going to all the different websites. And we do a lot of work around data literacy. So we open data for public good, and I think we've been around for 13 years. The first 5 years, we were really advocating for government agencies to open their data. It's very hard to find unless you're a data expert, and we still haven't really got a lot better at that. We started with very clear principles around how we open our data. And that one of those things being we don't publish any personal information. We only publish aggregate data, and we had to start with very clear principles, because when you're opening massive amounts of data like we do, you don't know what's going to happen to it once you publish it. So that's why attaching metadata to each and every chart and making sure everything is sourced really clearly and correctly. If you click on any of the charts in Figure NZ, you'll be able to see exactly where it comes from, any limitations, etc. to that. So yeah, that's our big core mission. Throughout the journey, we've spoken to lots of different professionals, and including when I was trying to figure out, okay, what data were we missing on our website? What data would be really useful for different communities that we serve? Academic and research data came up a lot, because there, as you know, there is incredible people working their lives to gather this really amazing data, but a lot of it even years ago, it's not Creative Commons licensed, it's not really open to the public. So for example, there's an amazing financial study going on at the University of Auckland, Dr. Carla Hokomo. She has a massive survey around Māori attitudes to finance. And she thinks she surveyed thousands of people. And so it came across that this data existed. And I was like, how do we publish this? Because this is really awesome information. It's been collected over like a time series, which we love. But yes, she wasn't able to publish. We weren't able to publish that data and open it just due to the ethics applications and all of the things that go on around universities. So again, I'm not a researcher myself. I do advise on different research topics. Yeah, but our main thing is, how do we open these important data sets to people? And I think what we're talking about today, which is the opposite of that, like how do we take our knowledge back, and how do we ensure that the knowledge is A, safely shared, and B, how do we ensure that the people that write the research, the experts that do all the work to clean the data, make sure that they're acknowledged. So yeah, one of the big things, risks in our industry in the open data space for us is obviously AI, like everyone else is talking about it. And they're big risks for us. We've built our technology based on website search, for one, and people just aren't really searching websites. Well, no one under 30 is. They are all getting their information, they're all just relying on ChatGPT and other GPTs out there. So this makes it really hard to ensure that the sources are correct, that even the data is correct. And we're seeing a lot of examples where incorrect data has been used in certain things. Yeah, and the risks are changing all the time. So I'm sure everybody as researchers are aware of this. So yeah, my problem to solve is, how do we open this data and make it accessible? At the same time, how do we make sure that the data is legitimate? And how do we make sure that the people that spend time working and researching all this data, how do we make sure that they are sourced correctly in the information that we do make open for the public? So yeah, again, I'm on the opposite side of the spectrum here, but hopefully I can add a little bit of value to the questions and just a different point of view for open access. Kia ora.
Thank you, Ngāpera. So that leads us to a bit of question time. We've already got some in the chat. I will always try and prioritize questions from the audience. So the first one is for Kathy, which is around how the idea of datafication translates beyond the sciences, particularly for writers, artists, and the whole issue of the data being scraped is the expression, which is also probably why paper mills are having even better days now. The fact that the expression can be so easily replicated through AI. I know you've already put a little bit of comment in the chat, but if you wanted to elaborate.
Sure. So there are things that we can already do using the regulatory points that we actually have. The problem is we seem to be in an age where we're just suspending their relevance and we're not simply applying them. So, there is no right to scrape creative work, text, anything without permission. Data itself is a different question from a copyright perspective, but there simply isn't an entitlement to actually do that. Although one of the things that is becoming apparent through things like the Anthropic litigation, which is the author test case, is that a lot of authors are realising that actually they've signed contracts where actually they don't actually own their content anymore. And I think in an academic context, that will be a much higher proportion. And also, many of us in the IP world are kind of being asked by academics all the time about these clauses, because the standard publication clauses now actually allow for the use of that content for AI, and it is very difficult to dislodge that. But some of the more disturbing clauses that I've been seeing aren't so much just about allowing it to be scraped, but allow for the author's image and likeness to be used in future iterations of work. So you publish the article, the publisher then uses you in perpetuity, your name, your reputation, your image, to do new versions of it, presumably AI updated. And I'm assuming this is primarily thought to be valuable in a teaching context. But But you also, these often include waivers of any moral rights. So you don't even get an entitlement necessarily to even see what content's out there being advertised in your name. I think that is a very pernicious and undermining practice. And I do think, that has to be really strenuously pushed back. But as I said in the chat, I don't think that these are issues that individuals can be expected to manage. We need institutional support to manage this. There are a lot of organisations whose livelihoods and public mission depend upon the reliability of information, and I do think they need to step up and not just say, "Oh, well, this is a question for publishers and authors." It's not.
And I mean, are we really holding publishers to sufficient account when retraction rates are increasing and there is no longer that reliability that they can be this standard of integrity? That really leads us to the point of that they're not even really doing what they're there to do anymore.
I was talking to a colleague morning tea today, and we were talking about the problems that once you find yourself cited in a hallucinated publication, we're going to use that term, that becomes part of the record. And so this teacher was teaching research methods and checking primary sources and stuff. And I said, well, hang on a minute, because the primary source is itself corrupted. Simply saying, using our traditional techniques don't work. And this comes back to the question of repositories. We need someone to have a, basically reliable custodianship of information to correct it, to retract it, to take it down. And there are no commercial imperatives to do that unless we create them. Why would a publisher put money into dealing with retractions responsively unless we insist upon it in our contracts with them?
And in that sense, we're changing the role of repository rather than it was traditionally very much about, so much is behind a paywall. We need that repository version. So Kathleen, is it about, do we need to start changing how we talk about repositories and their role? Like, we really need to expand it and make it more of a discussion around confirmation of integrity and a marker of trust.
Absolutely. I mean, we are currently developing a new strategy at COAR, and that's actually becoming a fundamental part of what our strategy is. And I think the institutional repository in particular has a very important role to play and has a competitive advantage, shall we say, because the institution knows who are members of their institution. So in that way, they won't accept, like all AI created papers from a false fake author or something like that. So there's already that level of institutional, shall we say, safeguarding that we have with our institutional repositories. But I think the next generation of repositories really needs to put much more effort into the curation of the content. Right now, it's not curated very well, into vetting what's coming in, and potentially even, which is what we're pushing for at COAR, is taking over the role of what publishers might do. So if we're having an event in Cambridge in a month from now that's called Putting Scholarly Publishing on Its Head, because this is about promoting the publish, review, curate model, where you deposit first, imagine, into your institutional repository. Then it's reviewed by reviewers from an external review service that are identified, and the reviews are made publicly available. And then, if another step wants to be that it's published by a journal, then it is. But it creates, a much more open verification of content. And because I think, Kathy, your point about just this loop of misinformation that becomes, more and more incorporated into the knowledge base is a real risk. And the other thing that we're really thinking about is, there's probably going to be a demand, a very strong demand at some point, you know, to have services, potentially AI services, but trusted AI services where you know you can go and verify, for example, the sort of conversational narrative claims that are coming from that AI and go back, link back to the original source where that's coming from. And so I think one of the things we're thinking about is how we can collectively move forward as a community to try and propose those kind of models as alternatives to what's currently happening now, which is, you know, if I may say, enshittification of the internet, which is a Cory Doctorow phrase. So that's my 2 cents on this particular issue.
Yeah, no, that's it's great. I suppose I'll pretend I'm a publisher rep for this one. You know, if universities are also looking to take over a bit of the publishing responsibility, you know, do they have the ability to protect those moral rights? Like, do they have the capacity to do that, police it? Maybe publishers have, you know, a bigger legal department to be going out there and putting takedown notices or talking with big tech companies that they might already have a relationship with, just to play a bit of devil's advocate.
I have no clue whether there's, you know, any publishers, well, certainly in the scholarly ecosystem that have gotten into legal issues with the AI companies, but I think it's more likely that they're just going to sell their content that they own because it's been signed over by the researchers to those AI companies and try to profit from it. So they might sue them if they feel that the AI companies are using that content illegally. But on the other hand, they're also probably, and Kathy mentioned some of the clauses now that researchers are signing, they're just essentially selling it so that they can just create another revenue stream.
Yes, the interests, commercial interests may trump
Yeah.
other motivations that universities should certainly have.
I know one British publisher that originally did not sell its material to an AI companies when that was quite a lucrative deal because not many of the big deals had happened. And they didn't do it on the grounds that they were concerned about reputational damage to their authors. So that was interesting. But their concern then was that because once the big publishers begin doing it, then they have a declining asset, basically, because their smaller collection is not as worth as much when you know the AI company has already bought some of the larger publishers into the deal. So, but similarly, I also went to a meeting 2 weeks ago with one of the AI companies, and they were saying, but they realise that misinformation is a huge problem, and they would like to slow it down. They'd like to slow their models down so they could address it. But they again say, oh no, but the market demands us to keep going regardless. And I do think we're in this kind of like crazy cycle at the moment where it's, you know, something's going to have to give here because it's clearly not going to be fit for purpose in any case.
Mm.
But one would think that the universities would have a big part to play in this. I would assume they would, because, you know, the quality of their universities rests on the quality of their researchers and the, you know, all the work they put forward. So I'm surprised the universities aren't really fighting to, I guess, protect their researchers.
I can make an uncomfortable observation, which when I go to university meetings about AI, they're populated by a lot of large, well-funded teams, many of whom are involved in the defence industries in Australia, in the US. There's a huge amount of money going into promoting use of AI in defence contexts, and we don't like talking about it because we don't like thinking about universities as part of the military-industrial complex, but I think we're deceiving ourselves.
Yes, interesting. Wayne's put a message in the comment that says it becomes a conflict of interest where universities are in competition with one another. Yeah, I just find the whole topic so interesting because the concept of open data was led out by scientists and researchers, right? They wanted to share their information and, you know, make it easier for other people to access. So my hope is that researchers can lead the way on this as well. But it seems, I don't know.
Have you seen any sort of change in behavior around the licensing of data to be more open? Are there some people that are getting
Well,
more?
I mean, when we first started 13 years ago, our first partners were the New Zealand Defence Force, Inland Revenue, and we chose them because they would be the hardest ones, right? They would be the hardest ones, and if they could start to open their data and see the benefits, then maybe others would. So the biggest change I've seen is that now almost everyone opens, well, not all of the data, of course, but the data that they can open safely. But yeah, I haven't heard of anyone not taking that back. But yeah, there's been a big change. This data open access revolution has happened quite quickly. The thing I'm more concerned about in my conversations with lots of government is that there's a lot of talk about AI, but no one seems to be specializing in it or really outlining the risks of what happens when what happens when data is getting, what happens when AI is getting used and giving wrong information. I think we saw last week, was it Deloitte or one of the top 4? They got caught using AI in one of their reports, and I think that's just not good enough. So hopefully we're seeing examples of this going wrong, which is generally when the policies around protections and stuff start to happen.
Do you think, and this could be for anyone, that there needs to be a bit more of a cohesive relationship, I would say, between library and research integrity officers in the university? Is that perhaps a relationship that we're not focusing on enough in pivoting this conversation around open and rights retention to a conversation around integrity?
Might be more of a question for Kathy, I think, or Kathleen.
I think it's a big problem. I think that one of the biggest obstacles to the implementation of rights retention that I've observed trying to actually get reform of my own institutions, IP policies and other Australian IP policies, is the fact that the library sort of sits to the side of a lot of these conversations. The research office are very hard to engage unless it immediately affects them. And then when it comes to things like rights retention, it gets carved off into a question about things that has nothing to do with like IP commercialisation. And so I think that the structure of universities splits the issues in ways which are very unproductive. But I mean, if there's a positive that comes from AI, it might be the fact that it's going to actually bring these things together, because it's keeping them apart is kind of untenable.
So obviously there's a lot to be concerned about, but potentially a lot of opportunities to reframe the discussion. If we take it back to our current context, where we're a fair bit behind Europe and their work around rights retention. Kathy, I know you're working, you mentioned a task force around trying to get a bit more momentum around this at the national level. What is it that people in the audience should be agitating for, or what should they be, who should they be talking to try and change some hearts and minds on this?
So I think it's a question about linking up some of these issues and the expectation of researchers that their work is treated with respect in all contexts, and that requires the university to assist in that and improving their policies so they stop pushing it down to the individual researcher is really, really important. In the chat, there was a discussion, and we mentioned briefly the whole question of the European secondary publication right. We don't actually need a formal publication right in a situation where we have such a small number of universities. We just need university IP policies where the institution retains those rights. And that's a more powerful way of doing it anyway, because we are the owners, we are the creators of the knowledge. We don't need government or a right to tell us. We already have the rights in our hands. I'm not a big fan of you relying on things like author statements, because the publisher contract will automatically just override that, and I think the courts will enforce the contract, not the pre-contractual negotiation. But in an Australian context, we can do that because our employer is our first owner of our, in a public university context, of our IP. That's not necessarily how it works with the structure of European universities, but the policies have the same intention and the same direction. We just need coordination to do it. I've not yet talked to anybody at senior management level universities who thinks it's a poor idea or they can't do it. They just don't get their act together to do it. And I don't understand why they don't understand why this is a priority. Hopefully things will change.
Yeah, can I add, from my experience, the impetus for these rights retention policies at institutions typically come from a funder mandate that say, okay, you must, make your article openly available. And then the funder mandate is not complied with by many, many researchers. And the best way to ensure that those policies can be complied with is the adoption of an institutional policy that, supports essentially the funder policy or the government policy. And so I think those two things together really are very strong. And so the other thing that I think you could be agitating for in this community is an open access policy by your major research funder or funders in Australia. That's usually very, very helpful in terms of the institutions becoming aware of this issue, and because they are also implicated in funder policies. They are the ones usually that are accepting the funding, not the researcher directly. So in a way, they are subject to any funder policy, and that sort of forces them to sort of think how it can be, what are the best actions locally to ensure that researchers will comply.
Thank you. I feel like we're at time already. Correct me if I am wrong, my wonderful supporting crew. But I think I'm supposed to wrap up around now. There's been some really interesting takeaways that I just immediately want to go and enact in terms of how we talk about these things within an institution. And I really liked the phrase that we need to treat the works with respect. I think, yeah, going back to integrity and respect and how we talk about knowledge, I think there's been a lot of really great gems, food for thought. And I think we need to stay core to the opening up research, and particularly research data has been hugely impactful. And yes, there may be risks around moral rights and misrepresentation, but I think it is better to solve that problem rather than to go back to when this work was not being built upon and having an impact beyond people who could buy this sort of data. So I think it's been a really positive message for the panel. So I thank you for all your insights, and I hope you'll be able to stick around for the second part of the session as I somewhat seamlessly move to the next section. So we are moving on to a discussion around action points that we can take, and we're very lucky to have Kathleen join us for the second session to talk about some of the initiatives coming out of COAR. So I will be having just to explain how this is going to work. Sorry. So there is 5 minutes for our speakers to talk through their initiatives, and then we're going to hand over to Richard, who is going to talk us through the activity with the Padlet. I noticed in the chat there was don't worry, there's no breakout rooms. Sorry, I dropped the collaboration bomb and then people probably dropped out. It's definitely going to be things you can contribute to anonymously, or you can just follow on the conversation that's happening in the Padlet. That's fine too. So first I'm going to hand over to Kathleen, who actually needs no introduction. And I believe you're going to talk a little bit about the paper pledge for the planet, Kathleen.
Yeah. And I note that Richard says in the chat we have 10 minutes, not 5 minutes.
Oh, wonderful.
So
There you
hopefully
go.
it is 10 minutes, but it'll be somewhere in between 5 and 10 minutes. So I have a presentation I would like to share with you. There we go. So this is a project that it was kind of an experiment on our behalf at COAR. And the idea was to choose a topic that was very, very, current, very important, where the impetus to make this literature openly available was very, very strong. And to try to work with the global community to crowdsource deposit of papers into the global repository network. So the project was actually originally, we were not originally part of the project, and then it sort of evolved into something different. And now we're one of the major players in the project, and it's called Paper Pledge for the Planet. And so, this you don't need to know about COAR. So yeah, the idea was to find all of the papers that were closed access. So they weren't already open access, but they they were published in journals that allowed deposit of the article accepted manuscript. And so over the last 5 years. And so we used OpenAlex to identify a list of, I think it was like 4,000 papers. And then we organized those papers according to countries. And then we recruited people from different countries to work on, getting their repository community to deposit the papers into their repositories. So here are 3,700 papers. And it was quite a, involved process, because we would hand over a list of, for example, all of the Australian papers. And I think we worked with Open Access Australasia, but it was definitely a group of Australians in the Australian context. And there was an institutional affiliation for the corresponding author, and off these people went to try to recruit the papers into their repositories. And so here's the kind of spreadsheet that we gave people. It was not very, you had to do a little bit of effort to really understand what the information there and so on. But this is the information that we provided people. And we had countries participating. This is a list of the countries that were participating, and it represented like 2/3 of the papers in our spreadsheet. China probably represented 1/3 of the papers in the spreadsheet. So there were many, many, many Chinese authors of these papers. And we worked with a group from China also to get them deposited into repositories. So here's just the information that's on our website. This was kind of the presentation I would give to each of the countries when I was explaining how the project worked. So, if you want to participate, you're still welcome to participate, and there's instructions for, how you can go forward with this kind of activity. So I'm trying to remember when this was launched, whether it was like close to a year ago now. And so we've managed to probably get about 1/3 of the papers, 1/3 of those 2,700 papers deposited into repositories, but there were a lot of challenges, and they're listed here. You know, first of all, you know, you try to contact the author and they just don't respond to your email, or they can't find the author accepted manuscript because like they submitted it 5 or 6 years ago. Some of the journals that we thought allowed deposit, it turns out they don't. And then we even heard from some countries, and you might be able to guess the main country, that climate change is like not a very politically expedient topic right now, and they would rather be working on a more high profile sort of project that was not focusing on climate change only. So I think from this, we learned some lessons. One is that maybe it was too large of a corpus, you know, like all climate change literature in 5 years. So it's difficult in that context to really say, we did it, you know? So we've done some of it, but we'll probably never do all of it. So in a way, we were unable to really get the momentum to promote and show and celebrate a success because of the way we organized the project. So I actually think in principle, it's a really good idea for promoting repositories and promoting open access. And I'm going to discuss with our executive board about continuing, you know, the principle of this project, but maybe changing slightly the way we do it. So maybe target, for example, an international publication that has, you know, 150 or 200 references in it, so something that's smaller in scope and more achievable, so that we could show we've done it, and we could link, for example, have something on the website where we link out to all of the references into the individual repositories. So I think our aim, and again, I'm going to discuss this with my executive board, is to like do this again and maybe try to do it for open access, somehow related to Open Access Week. So maybe we have the success, we can promote the success of the project during Open Access Week or something like that. So, I mean, for those of you who work in repositories, these challenges are not going to be a surprise to you. These are the challenges that you face every day in trying to populate the repository with, you know, valuable content. But I do think there are opportunities to kind of leverage this type of approach that would raise awareness of the value of repositories and the importance of open access in general. And I think that's it for my presentation.
Thanks, Kathleen. I know we participated at the University of Melbourne, and yes, mixed bag, as authors don't always respond. But I remember that we made a paper, Open Access, that was actually about climate change impacts for Pacific nations. And I thought, if there's ever a paper that needs to be open access, it's obviously ones that are dealing with our Pacific nation colleagues. So even one paper just felt like, you know, could make a difference there. I think that's well, it's not always about quantity, even though it helps. I'm now going to pass on to our second team of presenters. So we have a talk from our colleagues at James Cook University. So we're being joined by Jayshree Mamtora, Wayne Bradshaw, and Torva Lamberget.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I'm a little croaky. In this presentation, we'll talk you through our Bring Out Your Dead Green Open Access initiative that we've had in place here at James Cook University since last year. It's an example of one small attempt to wrest control over our knowledge, and one which other institutions out there may be able to easily adapt. James Cook University is what we would call a mid-sized, research-intensive university based in northern Queensland. In addition to its primary campus in Townsville, it has major campuses in Cairns and in Singapore. We like to see ourselves as a growing presence in the Australian open access landscape, and JCU takes some pride in ranking 5th in Australia for the proportion of open access publications for 2019 to 2022 in the Leiden Ranking Open Edition. As a proportion of research outputs, open access rates of publications rose markedly at JCU from 44% in 2014 to 71% in 2023, according to the latest COAR open access dashboard data. More recently, though, open access rates at JCU, as at many other Australian universities, have begun to slow down. At least in part, as a response to flattening open access rates, we've been working on several open access initiatives, including the Green Open Access competition, which we are discussing today to address that trend. For a little bit of context, at JCU, our institutional repository is called Research Online at JCU, and we have a broader open scholarship policy in place since 2022. We have 3 active JCU open journals and have also signed 19 read and publish agreements for 2025. We've established a variety of open access awards and identified open access champions across the academy. It's important to note that many of these strategies support one another. Last year, we initiated the Green Open Access competition and named it Bring Out Your Dead, with the aim of increasing the visibility and accessibility of the university's research outputs that were otherwise locked behind a paywall. More than half of JCU articles published prior to 2020 are not freely available to the public. The competition invited researchers to submit author-accepted manuscripts for records that were already in the repository. We promoted the competition by liaising with the Associate Dean's research for each college, as well as each of the open access champions who played a key role in encouraging colleagues to participate. We received submissions from every college and campus, with winners announced for each of the 7 entities, and events were organized at each college to celebrate the winners. We've taken a few opportunities to promote the initiative and help other institutions make it their own. So first, we carried out a presentation about the project at Research Support Community Day in June. We had an article published in the IFLA journal in July. And in August, we presented on our open access initiatives at the IFLA conference in Astana, Kazakhstan. The success of this initiative has led us to organize the competition again this year. This image demonstrates the workflow that we use for the initiative. It's quite simple, but it capitalizes on the competitiveness of academics. We promoted the competition through key contacts in the colleges, making good use of our champions as advocates, and we invited researchers to participate by emailing us to express their interest. Repository staff created bibliographies of eligible outputs for researchers and invited them to send as many of their manuscripts as was possible. Existing metadata records were then updated with the author-accepted manuscript and converted to open access. Winners were declared based on the number of records converted. We presented each winner with a 3D printed green open lock trophy and a certificate, and one college dean included a $300 cash prize for their winner. We celebrated their wins by promoting them through our various social media channels.
And here's one of our winners from 2024, Andreas Lopata, who is a professor in biochemistry. He sent us 12 accepted manuscripts as part of the competition, and the highest number submitted from his college. Celebrating the winners as part of a college event is an important way to raise further awareness of how researchers can make the outputs accessible, also retrospectively without additional costs. But of course, the question for our purposes is, did the submitted manuscripts make a difference to the rates of self-archiving in our repository? First, let's take a step back. This graph shows the number of author-accepted manuscripts deposited per year in our repository before we ran the competition. After 2021, as we can see, the rate of deposits slowed down, most likely due to the increased uptake of read and publish agreements. And here's the same graph, but including the deposits resulting from the competition. So when we added the 169 manuscripts we received as part of the competition, we arrived at a new total of 233 for 2024. This is the highest number of accepted manuscripts that a repository has received in one single year. The slight increase in 2023 is due to one researcher who deposited 26 manuscripts in response to an earlier pilot of this initiative.
So we've received a few questions about this project already, so I thought I'd put together something of a brief FAQ. First, everyone asks what the cost of the project was. Well, there were no additional costs. The cost of the project was the cost of materials for the trophies and the certificates. We already were running a 3D printer maker space, so that's no real monetary cost at all. What were the staffing requirements? Well, there were staffing requirements, but realistically, that was a few hours per week by one staff member, that was me, while the competition was running. If there is a cost, that's really the only practical cost to the repository. How many researchers participated? We had 33 researchers participate in that is to submit some amount of manuscripts in 2024. 2023 have requested bibliographies this year so far, although the AAMs are still coming in. How often do we run the competition? Well, we ran a pilot, as Tova suggested, in 2023, and then full-scale versions of the competition in 2024 and 2025. We're taking a break from it next year. You'll find the nature of this, because it's the whole of the archive that we're asking papers for. If you run it every year, it's going to go down. So my suggestion would be that it's like every 2, maybe even every 3 years, to give a chance for the amount of papers that you might get from a call like this to replenish. And how do we promote the competition? Well, as Jayshree suggested, a lot of our initiatives at the moment sort of interlock, and I think it's important to have voices within the colleges. So having those open access champions in the academy gave us sort of the stakeholders within the conversation as was happening in the disciplines. So the workflow on this slide on the right indicates the parts of the Green Open Access competition that were undertaken by the library in grey and by the entrance in green. It seems like a lot, but as I've kind of suggested, it isn't. There are a lot of small ways to reduce the burden of identifying and converting existing metadata records to full open access ones. People tend not to ask me these questions, so I've put them in here. Now, at JCU, we already store metadata records. I think at a lot of universities are the same. We will store metadata records for all outputs. So to be eligible for this competition, we required participating researchers to already have those records in the repository. That saves time. Entrants had to reach out to us to express interest in the competition. This meant we weren't chasing them up or trying to twist their arms or alternatively drowning in submissions. We knew what we were expecting. We prepared bibliographies of eligible records at our end. So I used the repository to get a list of publications and put together an achievable bibliography for the researcher with a focus on easy cases. So we're talking about Elsevier articles, Wiley, Springer Nature, you know the ones. I generally aim to fill a page or 2 of bibliography, so they're not drowning in articles. A lot of time can be saved by doing this at our end early, instead of relying on the researchers to try and navigate the self-archiving policies or the depths of their own publication record. This is also where the prospect of an institutional or even national rights retention policy would make the process a lot easier, because we wouldn't then need to check those self-archiving policies at all. It's worth saying that some of these easy cases can be really valuable and a strong selling point. Nature articles, for instance, it's worth reaching out personally to researchers who do a lot of publishing in flagship journals like Nature, where gold open access might cost more than $12,000 US. It means that we as the library can reach out to a senior researcher and offer to convert their Nature articles to open access for free. And it seems more like a service than an administrative burden to them at that point. So beyond that, we attach the AAMs. They just email the AAMs to us. We attach them to existing records, and add a point in the simplest Excel worksheet you've ever seen in your life that is just a list of names with a number next to each one. Each time I make an AAM live, I add a point to the spreadsheet. I also make a note of their college, and that's it. That allows us to determine winners and also to get stats for later on. So what did this initiative mean for us at JCU? Well, it made more of the university's research open access at no cost to the institution. That's the big one. It improved understanding and awareness about green open access. In particular, it's something we find is it's a pathway to open access researchers generally are less informed about, and this kind of was a fun way to teach them about it. It improved our visibility within the research community. We're here talking to you today, and we've had questions and interest about the project from the University of Dresden, from the University of Hong Kong, from Stellenbosch, from the American University of Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan. I think we might have someone from Kyrgyzstan in the audience today. From Maynooth, we've had interest in Australia from RMIT. I had a great chat with someone from QUT and Queensland Health. Thanks for listening to us today talking about this project. If you'd like to learn more about it, feel free to reach out to us. We can supply you with materials, but as you've seen, it's actually pretty simple. And we've published an article, as Jayshree said, on the subject. If you want some of the details there, the links on the screen.
Thank you, Wayne, Torba, and Jayshree. I hope you printed yourselves one of those amazing trophies. I think the initiative itself deserves a trophy, and really amazing reversing that decline in repository deposits as a result of read and publish. That graph was a beautiful, beautiful transition. I enjoyed that. So you are free to still add questions for our presenters. They will be around for the next 15 minutes and one has already popped in. So if our presenters can keep an eye on the chat. But for now, I am going to hand over to Richard Blanc, the révolutionnaire français, who is getting ready to rile everyone up to join the revolution. Richard.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, Dimity. One of the goals we had for today's session was to help people understand that we do have power. We often hear people talk about these things in a negative way. I have no power in my relationship with my publisher. AI companies are taking everything. I just have to accept the terms that I'm offered. Please do imagine the soundtrack that I'm pasting in the chat there as I'm speaking. As Kathy Bowrey said earlier, I've written this one down and I'm going to reuse it. Knowledge is about relationships. You do have rights. It's a question of understanding them and how you can assert them. After hearing the talks yesterday about community custodianship and Napera today talking about freeing up access to things, I've been reflecting on the idea of using open as a way of sharing the responsibility for taking care of knowledge. And ensuring that we're looking after it better that way. Academia has a proud history of revolutionary action. There was a cost of knowledge boycott where thousands of people refused to publish, referee, or work for certain publishers. Some universities have cancelled subscriptions and negotiated better deals. That may be happening not too far from home right now. There have been cases where editorial boards have resigned en masse and set up their own non-profit alternatives. We heard this week in the session, I think it was yesterday's one as well, about the Open Library of Humanities, and there are lots of other examples of that sort of initiative. We talked about secondary publishing rights today. You could even mention things like Sci-Hub or ICANN has PDF hashtags on Twitter as examples of revolutionary action by academics. So our message is, having had the positive examples we've just heard from Kathleen and from the team at JCU, we are not powerless. We are many, and collective strength is ours to harness. So we want to end the session on a positive, practical note, and I pasted the Padlet note there for people to go and look at. I'll share my screen so that people can also see the same thing. So we want you guys to share with us the things that you've taken away from today, ways that we can assert our own rights, things you might have taken away from the sessions earlier in the week. They might be just that you're going to do your own Bring Out Your Dead project. You might want to change your institutional IP policy. It doesn't necessarily have to be things that you as an individual can do. Kathy talked earlier as well about putting pressure on our leadership to have these discussions and assert these things at a higher level as well. So go to the Padlet. It's very easy to use. You just click on this box in the corner. A thing appears and you type some words in and then hit publish up here. It will be anonymous if you don't have a Padlet account. So you don't have to say who you are. You can if you like. But otherwise, we're going to sit here for a few minutes and watch the magic happen before our eyes. Dimity, I don't know if we want to, just while people are typing, that's something we could address one or two of the questions that have come in for the presenters while people are percolating their thoughts.
Because there is definitely a recent one for the JCU team around, did you add the AAM for items that were already open in other institutional repositories? Or was the focus purely on closed, completely closed?
Am I muted or am I talking?
You're talking, Ryan.
I am talking. I was just typing the answer. Yeah, we tend to do, I personally, I think a few of us are like this, we have unpaywall running as a plugin at the time that we're processing. So if it's already unlocked, if it's already available as an AAM somewhere, I'll just pull it from there, and I will store another copy open. For the purposes of the competition, not so much. I leave it up to them to supply the AAM, but in theory, most of those should already be open. And I have been known to notice that if a journal's flipped gold or something, then I'll just update it, and I'll give them a generous point. But
thanks, Wayne. I'm trying to see if we had any questions about that. Yes, we've already answered this around the not keeping track of their AAM, the copy pasting text from the version of record.
I would never suggest that in an official email.
No.
Yes, every time.
Okay, we've got some things coming in, Richard.
Yeah, great. The ideas are flowing. I'm reminded, just following up on what Wayne was saying as I was preparing for this, I was reminded of the famous example of the Happy Birthday song, where essentially Time Warner said they had the rights to it for years and years and years and were charging people for it. Then it turned out when someone challenged them that they didn't necessarily have the rights that they said they had, and they had to settle and stop charging people for using it. Just reacting to the do not obey in advance comment there. I should also add, I'm not speaking on behalf of my institution today. I'm speaking in personal capacity.
That's why you changed your surname, right?
Yes, I'm Richard Blanc today, yes.
Sorry, I'm going to start having a look at my eyesight needs stronger glasses.
So someone says they're going to copy JCU's awesome idea, with attribution, of course, I'm sure. That's great. Someone else said the same thing, yeah.
I like the approach of going for that expression of interest Because yeah, I must admit with the paper pledge and also, you know, if you're chasing things that maybe need to comply with funder mandates, sometimes you can get a bit disheartened about the uneven response rate. But yeah, sort of framing it initially of, well, actually, we're here to support people who want to get involved, I think is a really good approach and ensures that staff feel like they're immediately going to have an impact.
We'll leave the Padlet open for a bit as well. So if people, you know, over the course of the rest of the day want to add things, then they can do that too. Yeah, someone's put in there, remind researchers if they didn't sign a publication agreement. Actually, then the publishers probably don't really have any rights over the material. They've said pre-digital era, but that probably applies in lots of cases. Lots of diamond journals that we run out of our own departments don't make people sign agreements. There's just kind of implicit trust there. But, you know, first of all, the employer, and then probably the author by IP rights policy owns the copyright in it, and they're not transferring it in that sort of relationship.
I might pop this on afterwards, but I'm definitely thinking about the conversation earlier about framing repositories as a trust marker and the issues around sort of respecting our research and sort of fighting against the issues of things being misattributed and particularly through AI and having that conversation at an AI working group. We have AI working groups at this institution, and I remember last year I raised it when they were speaking at the research conference, the representatives, and they were like, well, open access really, it's been shown to be problematic because now it's just so much easier for AI companies to scrape all this research. And I was like, give me that microphone back. But yeah, I think I've thought of a new way to reframe the conversation. For sure.
Yeah, I was reflecting on a similar thing when now Peter was talking as well about that curated, reliable, authoritative source of things. As like you say, that trust marker element. Yeah. I can still see a couple of people are typing, so there may be a couple more coming in, but that's a nice thing. We should, as a sort of a sweep up afterwards, we'll get Janet to post the link back round to the Padlet, and so that people can look at these again afterwards. And of course, they'll be on the recording when the recording is available too. Otherwise, maybe I'll hand back to you to wrap up, Dimity.
Thanks, Richard. I like err on the side of open, not caution.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So closing out Open Access Australasia's sessions for the week. I wish everyone good luck who might have sessions happening at their own institutions later today or tomorrow. It is always such a motivating time of year, and I actually think it's a really good time. Sometimes I'm like, October, it all feels like a lot is going on. But when you're in that last quarter of the working year and you're sort of feeling a little bit depleted, and then you come into Open Access Week and you listen to the incredible speakers that our organizers line up each year, it really gives you energy to go into planning for the year ahead. And I think in that way, it is actually perfectly timed. I want to thank all our speakers today. So we had Kathleen Shearer, double speaker. Thank you, Kathleen. We had our wonderful Kathy Bowrey and Napera Riley, and I really enjoyed that panel. Thank you again. And then the wonderful team at JCU, which I feel has inspired people afresh all again. Thank you, Wayne, Jayshree, and Torva. The organizing committee for 2025, an amazing committee. It happens that so many people just bring so much every year I am always incredibly grateful about how they prepare me for my facilitation duties. But I want to thank Richard White, Donna Coventry, and Elizabeth Lawrence, particularly for this session, but of course, a thank you for the whole planning committee. Janet Catterall, our amazing OA Australasia program manager. Janet just every year, so many plates, and she keeps everything running smoothly. Thank you, Janet. And of course, a thank you to the supporting Open Access Australasia Executive Committee. I hope everyone really enjoyed the session, and I hope you're feeling as energized as I am. And happy Open Access Week. Go take back some knowledge.
Great, and I'll close us out with the karakia to finish with, Dimity.
Thank you, Richard.
Unuhia, te pole, kia wātea, ai